Ever since Library of Ruina, Bleed has been a staple of boss fight tactics in two Project Moon games now. From Queen of Hatred back in the old days, to the many bosses of Limbus Company, every encounter with just one enemy falls before Bleed. And with the release of Red Eyes Ryoshu, I believe that more Bleed identities will be released all the way in Season 5. So, what better time than now to talk about the state of Bleed teams? Much like my other team state videos, today we're going to go over what I consider to be the best Bleed team you can build, its pros and cons, as well as the variations of this team that I find acceptable. I will explain exactly why I picked every identity and ego for the team, and by the end of the video, Bleed will be placed on my team tier list, where Charge, Poise and Sinking already reside. So stick around until the end to see just how strong this iconic team composition can get. But before we start, I have to remind you all that 92% of my viewers are not subscribed, and if you find yourself enjoying my content, consider subscribing to the channel, as it helps me out a lot more than you might think. Starting off, here's the team of 6 with all the support identities. A lot of expected faces, I imagine, but maybe a few picks that you wouldn't agree with. So to explain why I went for this team, let's go over each identity and what they bring to the table. Also, don't forget that a bit later we will go over variations, so you will likely see your preferred pick there. Starting off, we have arguably one of the best IDs in the entire game, Ring Pointillist Yi-Sang. His strength needs no introduction, but still, let me recap exactly what he can do. His passive is very easy to activate early in this team, and it allows him to heal SP when attacking a target with Bleed. If he is at max SP, however, his passive increases his offense level instead, setting up his monstrous second and third skills nicely. Speaking of his skills, Sanguine Pointillism, his skill 2, clashes at up to 20 power, and can dish out massive damage by rerolling a 10 power coin. Every hit with that coin inflicts 1 bleed count and 3 count for random effect, one of which is bleed as well. If you hit both rerolls, you have around a 50-50 chance to inflict 6 bleed count with 1 usage of Sanguine Pointillism, on top of the insane damage it can dish out. His third skill works in a similar way, being able to apply 3 bleed count and 3 bleed potency on an enemy consistently, while also sometimes high rolling for +6 and +5 respectively. It also deals huge damage with its last coin, instantly making Yi-Sang the strongest identity on this team. My next choice is a lot less overpowered, but I believe that N-Corp Faust also makes the cut for the team. She specifically works well alongside Ring Yi-Sang, as her unique gaze effect can increase the damage of all pierce and blunt skills by 20%. On top of that, she can inflict nails, which is another special effect that supports bleed count by turning into it at turn end, and then being halved. Faust suffers from having a really low roll on her third skill, which reaches only 12. To compensate, she gets a powerful passive which allows her to heal a total of 30 SP at turn start, targeting 2 allies with the lowest SP and healing 15 SP each. This effectively buffs the clash power of those allies if used early in the fight, so the average power of the team still rises. My next pick is Red Eyes and Penitence Ryoshu. Unlike the previous two identities, Ryoshu doesn't specialize in pierce damage. However, she deals blunt damage, which is still supported by Gaze, so even though she differs from the rest of the team, she won't fall behind against pierce weak enemies. Ryoshu's specialty is rolling really high, with her skill 2 reaching 22 power, and her skill 3 being even stronger. Unlike most other members of this team, Ryoshu does not have any bleed count in her kit, but instead she gets to inflict a lot of bleed potency. With Red Eyes in their final stage, her skills 1 through 3 inflict 4, 5 and 6 potency respectively, which is a good amount for someone who is a physical damage frontrunner on the team. She also gets a good spread of ego affinities, being able to support her team with both Envy and Lust. Next up we have R-Corp Mersault. This identity is one of my favorites, and I actually don't see much praise for it for some reason. I believe R-Corp Mersault is a great identity in Bleed, and here's exactly why. His second skill can inflict up to 4 bleed count in one use, and his third skill inflicts up to 6. This instantly makes him potentially the strongest bleed support on the team, as Mersault makes sure the enemy does not run out of bleed count. Another great thing about him is that the conditions for the bleed count are rather easy to fulfill. His second skill, Demolish, inflicts double its normal bleed count when Mersault is at 7 or more speed. To get to this high speed, Mersault uses his passive, which increases his max speed by 2 for every 5 charge on himself up to 6. This means that at 15 charge, Mersault can reach a maximum speed of 11, making the threshold for Demolish easily achievable. Whenever Mersault isn't using Demolish at high speeds, he can spend his charge on Rhinoram, his third skill. At 10 charge, this skill gets plus 2 coin power, which is enough to increase its clash power to 21. That charge is then spent with his coins to inflict up to 4 additional bleed count. If Rhinoram is used early, right after just one Demolish, it can inflict a total of 5 count anyways, which is still a great amount of bleed. There's even more depth to Mersault's power, but we'll get there a bit later in the ego section of the video. The next identity on the team is none other than the Pequod Captain Ishmael. She is yet another pierce damage dealer who also has a decent amount of supportive skills. Starting from the top, the main reason why this identity is used in Bleed is her third skill, Harpoon of Obsession. This skill deals a lot of pierce damage, scales and damage against enemies with low HP, and, crucially, gains up to 2 coin power from Bleed on target. If used at the right time, her skill 3 can shred, pierce or wrath weak enemies, making Ishmael a strong pick for any quick bleed team instantly. However, Ishmael can do even more than that. Her second skill applies 3 offense level up to 2 adjacent allies, which is incredibly effective at increasing the damage of Yi Sang, but also will pretty consistently tag 2 allies, as even though Ishmael is fast, a charged Mersault can reach much higher speeds. Her second skill also has the effect of assist attack, which is always useful because it is free damage, but it's especially useful in Bleed, as a lot of the other identities have good first skills which inflict more bleed. Effectively, using Pequod Captain's second skill adds more bleed into the economy, while also being pretty consistent, considering how widespread Last Resonance is in this team. The last piece of the Bleed team puzzle is the Ring Pointillist Otis. She is the only 2-star of the team, but she's here for good reason. Her strongest skill for this team is Sanguine Painting, her second skill. It might seem unassuming at first, with a max power of 13 and a clash power conditional, but in reality, this skill can dish out great damage and inflict a lot of bleed count. Much like Yi Sang, Otis can reroll her last coin of the skill, which inflicts 1 bleed count initially and plus 2 count on reroll. In total, if you hit both rerolls, this skill can inflict plus 5 bleed count, helping the team tremendously. Her other skills are pretty decent too. Skill 1 is Lust, which makes it easier to proc Faust's passive and assist attack, and it can reach 14 clash power, which isn't necessarily high, but can help you fight back if you're out of options. Her third skill is a way weaker version of Yi Sang's skill 3, but it can still deal some damage, inflict beat and other effects, and also set up Mersault by giving him 1 haste next turn if he's adjacent to Otis. Before we move on to support, let's take a look at the variants of this team that can reach good results. First off, you can substitute Lobotomy Roshu on Arcorp Mersault with Kurakumo Roshu and Hook Honglu to form a Bleed Pierce team. You can use the Pequod Harpooner Heathcliff for this job as well. In such a formation, Bleed becomes a mono Pierce team that can effectively take advantage of the enemy's Pierce weakness. This team is better than what I recommend whenever you're facing an encounter that has only Pierce weak enemies and can be cleared in under 10 turns. The reason why I bring up the turns is because by taking away the 2 most setup reliant identities of this team, you make the composition much faster, meaning that for the purpose of speed clearing short encounters, this change is a net positive. Harpooner and Hook are generally good choices for Bleed in a lot of situations actually. Harpooner is especially good at generating envy for Hexnail, as well as clashing better than Mersault in the early turns. If you're bringing him, you might want to consider Blade Lineage Dawn as a support option, as she helps make his second skill a bit more consistent in actually proccing its effect. However, that does mean missing out on some pierce damage, so choose wisely. Hook, on the other hand, can inflict a good amount of bleed count with his second skill very early into the fight, which makes hitting a lot of conditionals easier. He also has a skill 3 similar to Harpoon of Obsession, so Honglu can be used as a damage dealer if you don't have Ishmael. He's also much cheaper since he's a 2-star, so if you got him from the Walpurgisnacht event and you're a newer player, upgrading Honglu is definitely worth it. Staying on the topic of Honglu, some of you may be wondering where is Ting Tang. And to that, I have to say that he's a secondary option in place of Roshu. It's true that he can dish out great damage, specifically great Pierce Last damage. But we already have Yi Sang and Roshu who fill the role of physical damage, while also bringing more bleed value to the team. Honglu, on the other hand, doesn't inflict bleed well, so he's a step below Roshu. Against enemies resistant to blunt, he is the better option, but otherwise I don't recommend swapping anyone for him. He's also specifically really good in human fights, which aren't exactly the best place to use bleed. Another option is swapping out Lobotomy Roshu for her Kurokuma variant. This lowers the physical power of the team by a sizable margin, but in return you get a much safer team in regards to bleed count. This works especially well if your Kurokuma Roshu is at uptime 4, as after that upgrade, between her second and third skills she has 9 bleed count in her kit, none of which require any setup, which makes her a very consistent option for bleed upkeep. Now that we've seen all the variants of this team, let's move on to the support identities. Starting with Dawn, she should be running her base identity. Her effect is a simple plus 10% pierce damage for one ally, and it will likely target Yi Sang for a good portion of any encounter. If you're running my initial recommended team, Honglu should be set to Kurokuma for free additional bleed on the fastest ally. You might be tempted to go for Ting Tang instead, but this team generates almost no gluttony, meaning you won't get to make use of his passive. Heathcliff is running his Arcorp ID. Much like Dawn, he provides the team with free pierce damage, however it's not exactly consistent, considering that Armor Salt will often outspeed the whole team and end up taking the passive while not dealing any pierce damage. Rhodia is set to base form, as her ability isn't difficult to activate, and it provides free damage as well. In this team her effect is going to tag Mersault, which might not seem perfect at first, but once I tell you a bit more about Mersault's power, it's going to make sense. Sinclair is pretty much out of options here, as none of his identities have any bleed-related passives, and the conventionally decent ability of Blade Lineage cannot be activated due to the low amount of pride on this team. That being said, I personally see a case for the One Who Shall Grip. This identity gives blunt damage to the ally with the lowest SP. Lobotomy Roshu is the one who will get this bonus often, as her skills force her to lose a bit of SP, meaning she can often stay slightly below 45 SP, guaranteeing that she will be targeted by Sinclair's ability. Lastly, we have Gregor, and his two options are base form and Kurokumo. His base form provides the team with a bit of healing, and isn't difficult to activate, while his Kurokuma identity allows an ally with the lowest speed to lower an enemy's offense level by hitting them while they have a lot of bleed. If the passive is activated 3 times in one turn, the effect is pretty much equal to -1 clash power on the enemy, which is a great upgrade for a team that can be rather lacking in the clashing department. Now let's finally move on to ego skills. First off, I've been hyping up Mersault, so let's start with him. His hidden ace is the Regret ego skill, which increases the coin power of his skills by 2, but decreases their base power by 1. This effect is best used whenever Mersault has multiple skills with a high amount of coins, and luckily, both the second and third skills of Arcorp Mersault have 3 coins, which makes them benefit from a total power increase of 5. With the effect active, Demolish clashes at 19 power, and Rhino Ram with its setup active can reach 26 power. This turns Mersault from a subpar clasher into a great one, and makes his presence on the field a lot more noticeable, as he allows weaker identities inflict all their bleed count and damage, while Mersault soaks up damage and wins important clashes. Another notable ego of his is Capote, as it provides Mersault with an instant clash win button, as well as 2 haste next turn, which helps set up Demolish. This skill is also really cheap, meaning you can fire it off early into the fight to kickstart your bleed count the turn after that. Another notable ego is Contempt Awe, which inflicts a total of 15 bleed, but can be hard to use. Frost's Hex Nail inflicts Pierce Fragility, which greatly helps the damage of the team. It also inflicts nails at Threat Spin 4, which helps out with bleed. Ishmael's Blind Obsession also works well to increase the power and damage of the team, while also recovering SP, although at a pretty high cost. Ishmael can also make use of Roseate Desire to help out with Last Resonance, while crippling an enemy for a turn at a very low cost. Otis can make use of Yasunyata Tadrupam to set up a last chain damage turn. This effect is even stronger when using the corrosion variant of the skill. This is pretty much it for Eagle, so before we move on to the tier list, let me talk about when to use bleed teams. The obvious answer is on bosses, where bleed can be used to stack to very high amounts on a single part of a multi-part boss, or for high amounts of free damage on single part bosses. Due to the prevalence of Pierce damage in this team, it can also be used against Pierce weak human encounters, and the same goes for Last weak encounters, as this team generates a lot of physical Pierce and Last damage, while being able to use bleed as a stepping stone for conditionals if nothing more. Moving on to the tier list, I will be placing bleed in A tier. This might be a bit unreasonable to some of you, so let me explain my reasoning. On boss encounters, I find bleed to be strictly better than sinking. The effect is much easier to stack, courtesy of the many skills that inflict additional bleed count. Continuing the comparison with sinking, bleed deals fixed damage, which cannot be resisted, unlike the gloom damage of sinking. On the contrary, it also cannot deal more damage to enemies which would be weak to it, but even though Project Moon have been feeding us gloom weak enemies lately, I believe that is going to change, which would put bleed above sinking even as an effect. But we're comparing teams specifically, and as a team, bleed has more cohesion, as you can build powerful mono-pierce teams that shred enemies with pierce weaknesses, while also having access to a lot of Last Resonance and Last-based passives. When comparing sinking and bleed teams, bleed is just a better tool for bosses while also reaching higher damage numbers due to the multiple great damage dealers on the team. I think this disparity warrants a whole tier break, putting bleed a tier above sinking. Still, it's not as dumb and easy to play as Poise and Charge, both of which absolutely demolish slash and blunt weak encounters respectively, so I can't in good conscience put bleed on par with them. However, I might also be affected by recency bias, as both blunt and slash have been better than pierce in 80% of the content for like half a year now, and once we get to experience the pierce prowess of bleed against a pierce weak boss, I might go back on my placement and put bleed even higher. And that's about it for the boss killing machine that is bleed. If you disagree with my team composition or my tier list placement, please leave a comment below to tell me about it. However, I ask you to remain civil and provide actual numbers when arguing, so that the discussions don't turn into meaningless scuffles. Thank you so much for watching until the end, and if you found yourself enjoying the video at any point, leave a like and consider subscribing to my channel to see more content like this. This was Ultranum, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye!